Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. Working as a night shift nurse at Seattle General Hospital, she developed sharp eyes for details that could mean the difference between life and death. But it wasn't just at work where her observational skills came in handy. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., she would stop at Corner Cafe on Pine Street for her usual coffee before heading home from her shift. The small cafe had become her routine, a peaceful moment before facing another day of managing her elderly mother's care and catching a few hours of sleep. That's when she first noticed him, David Chen, though she wouldn't learn his name for weeks. He was a tall man in his early 40s, always impeccably dressed in expensive suits, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't his obvious wealth or his perfectly styled appearance. It was his son. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with messy black hair and clothes that never quite matched. While his father stood in line scrolling through his phone with intense concentration, the child would sit alone at a corner table, quietly eating a plain bagel and drinking chocolate milk. The boy's backpack was worn and patched in several places, a stark contrast to his father's polished exterior. Sarah began timing her coffee stops to coincide with theirs, not out of curiosity about the wealthy businessman, but because something about the child tugged at her heart. She watched as the father would order his elaborate coffee drink, a double-shot cortado with oat milk and an extra shot, while barely glancing at his son. The boy never asked for anything different, never complained, just sat patiently until his father finished his business calls. One rainy Tuesday morning, Sarah noticed the boy coughing repeatedly. It was a deep, concerning cough that made her nurse instincts kick into high gear. The father remained absorbed in what appeared to be an important phone conversation about quarterly reports and board meetings. The boy covered his mouth politely, trying not to disturb his father, but Sarah could see the flush in his cheeks and the way he struggled to catch his breath between coughing fits. She found herself moving closer, pretending to add sugar to her coffee while keeping an ear on the conversation. The boy's breathing seemed labored, and she noticed him rubbing his chest as if it hurt. When his father finally ended the call, he simply said, "Come on, Marcus. We're late," without seeming to notice his son's obvious discomfort. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. She wanted to get a better look at the boy who had been occupying her thoughts. Marcus looked paler than before, and that concerning cough had worsened. This time she noticed other things too. The way he barely touched his food, how he kept rubbing his temples as if he had a headache, and most alarmingly, the slight wheeze in his breathing that her trained ear picked up immediately. His father, David, was even more distracted than usual, juggling 2 phones and a tablet while Marcus sat quietly, clearly feeling unwell. Sarah watched as the man ordered his usual complicated drink and grabbed a protein bar for himself, but seemed to forget entirely about getting anything substantial for his son. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had spent years watching people ignore signs that seemed obvious to her, and she couldn't stand by and watch a child suffer in silence any longer. She approached their table just as David was gathering his things. "Excuse me," she said politely, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm a nurse, and I couldn't help but notice your son has been coughing quite a bit. Has he been feeling all right?" David looked up from his phone, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "He's fine," he said curtly, not even glancing at Marcus. "Just a little cold. Nothing serious." But Sarah had been doing this too long to be dismissed so easily. She looked directly at Marcus, whose eyes met hers with a mixture of hope and resignation that broke her heart.
"Hi there," she said to the boy.
"I'm Sarah. How are you feeling today?" Marcus glanced nervously at his father, then back at Sarah. "My chest hurts," he whispered so quietly she almost missed it. "And it's hard to breathe sometimes." David's attention snapped to his son for the first time that morning. "Marcus, don't be dramatic. It's just a cough," but even as he said it, Sarah could see a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. "Sir," Sarah said, maintaining her professional composure, "I've been a nurse for 15 years, and what I'm hearing and seeing suggests this might be more than just a cold. Children can develop complications quickly, especially respiratory issues." For the first time since Sarah had been observing them, David actually looked at his son, really looked at him. She watched as he took in the pale skin, the labored breathing, the way Marcus was hunched over slightly as if trying to ease the pressure in his chest. The busy executive who had seemed so confident and in control suddenly looked lost and scared. He's been coughing for a few days. I thought it would go away on its own. I've been working on this merger. And His voice trailed off as the reality of the situation began to sink, and Sarah's heart went out to both of them. The child who had been suffering in silence and the father who had been too consumed with work to notice. Sometimes the most dangerous symptoms are the ones that seem minor at first, she said gently. Would you like me to take a quick look at him? I can at least tell you if this needs immediate attention. The transformation in David's demeanor was immediate and complete. The powerful businessman who had been dismissing her concerns moments before was now hanging on every word, desperate for guidance. It was the beginning of a connection none of them could have predicted, and the first step in a journey that would save more than just Marcus's health. Sarah knelt down to Marcus's eye level, her movements careful and non-threatening. The boy looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes that reminded her of her younger patients at the hospital. She could immediately see what his father had missed, the subtle blue tinge around his lips that indicated poor oxygen circulation, and the way his nostrils flared slightly with each breath. Can you take a deep breath for me, sweetheart? She asked Marcus, her voice warm and encouraging. The boy tried, but the breath was shallow and triggered another coughing fit. This time Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. Tiny flecks of blood in the tissue Marcus used to cover his mouth. Her years of experience kicked in, and she knew immediately that this was far more serious than anyone had realized. David watched the interaction with growing alarm. Is that blood? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah maintained her calm professional demeanor, but inside, alarms were going off. We need to get Marcus to a hospital right now, she said firmly. This isn't something that can wait. The color drained from David's face. For all his success in the boardroom, he was completely out of his depth when it came to medical emergencies. What do I do? Should I call 911? My car is right outside, but I don't know which hospital. My shift ended an hour ago, but I can drive you to Seattle General, Sarah offered without hesitation. I know the emergency department staff and we can get Marcus seen immediately. David nodded frantically, all thoughts of his morning meetings forgotten. As they rushed to Sarah's car, he found himself relying completely on this stranger who had appeared in their lives at exactly the right moment. Marcus leaned heavily against his father, his breathing becoming more labored with each step. During the short drive to the hospital, Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Marcus, monitoring his condition while trying to keep David calm. Tell me about his medical history, she said. Has he had any respiratory problems before? Allergies? Recent illnesses? David realized with horror how little he actually knew about his son's health. His mother used to handle all that. She died 3 years ago, and since then it's mostly been our housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, who takes care of those things. I travel so much for work. His voice cracked with the weight of his admission. What about his pediatrician? When was his last checkup? Sarah pressed gently. I don't know, David whispered, the words feeling like knives in his throat. Mrs. Rodriguez schedules those appointments. I always assumed everything was fine because no one told me otherwise. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for this man, who was clearly a devoted father, but had gotten lost in his own success. She had seen it before. Parents who provided everything materially but missed the emotional and physical cues their children desperately needed them to notice. At the hospital, Sarah's connections proved invaluable. She bypassed the usual emergency room wait times and got Marcus directly to Dr. Patricia Wells, one of the best pediatric pulmonologists in the city. Within minutes, Marcus was hooked up to monitors and breathing treatments while Dr. Wells examined him thoroughly. Mr. Chen, Dr. Wells said after completing her initial assessment, your son has pneumonia and it's quite advanced. If you had waited even another day or two to bring him in, we could have been looking at a much more serious situation. David felt his knees go weak. Pneumonia. But I thought it was just a cough. Children often don't show the classic symptoms adults do, Dr. Wells explained patiently. The good news is that we caught it in time, thanks to. She looked at Sarah questioningly. Sarah Martinez, Sarah supplied. I'm a nurse here on the night shift. Well, Ms. Martinez potentially saved your son's life by recognizing the signs, Dr. Wells continued. We'll need to admit Marcus for at least 3 days for IV antibiotics and respiratory support. As the medical team worked to stabilize Marcus, David found himself sitting in the hallway next to Sarah, both of them watching through the glass window as his son received the care he desperately needed. The successful CEO who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals was reduced to a frightened father who had nearly lost the most important person in his world. "I almost killed him," David said quietly, his voice hollow with shock and guilt. "I was so focused on work, on providing for him financially, that I nearly let my own son die from neglect." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing past the expensive suit to the broken man underneath. "You didn't know," she said gently. "Parents aren't expected to be medical professionals. The important thing is that he's getting help now." "But I should have known," David insisted. "I'm his father. I should have noticed he was sick. I should have been paying attention instead of worrying about stock prices and board meetings." Over the next few hours, as Marcus was settled into his room and began responding well to treatment, Sarah found herself staying far longer than she had planned. She watched David transform before her eyes, from the distracted businessman she had observed in the cafe to a devoted father who refused to leave his son's bedside. "I need to call Mrs. Rodriguez," David said suddenly, reaching for his phone. "She needs to know where we are, and I need to ask her about his medical history." As he made the call, Sarah overheard fragments of the conversation that painted a clearer picture of their family dynamic. Mrs. Rodriguez, it seemed, had been trying to get David's attention about Marcus's health for weeks, but he had been too busy with a major acquisition to take her calls seriously. "She says he's been complaining about feeling tired and having headaches for almost a month," David reported after ending the call, his face pale. "She scheduled a doctor's appointment for next week, but she was worried it was getting worse. She tried to tell me, but I kept saying it could wait until after the merger closed." The weight of missed opportunities hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah could see the guilt eating away at this man who had built an empire, but had nearly lost his most precious treasure through simple inattention. "Children are resilient," she offered. "What matters now is that you're here and you're learning. This doesn't have to define your relationship with Marcus." David looked through the window at his sleeping son, hooked up to monitors and breathing more easily thanks to the medical intervention. "I don't know how to be a better father," he admitted. "I thought providing for him financially was enough. I thought keeping the business successful was the best gift I could give him." Sarah followed his gaze to Marcus, who looked so small and vulnerable in the hospital bed. "Maybe this is your wake-up call," she said softly. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to help us see what really matters." 3 days in the hospital changed everything for David Chen. Sarah had expected to leave after ensuring Marcus was in good hands, but something kept drawing her back. Maybe it was her natural nursing instincts, or perhaps it was watching a father struggle to connect with the son he realized he barely knew. On the second day, she stopped by during her dinner break to check on Marcus's progress. She found David sitting beside the bed, looking completely lost as he tried to help his son with a simple coloring book the child life specialist had brought. "I don't know what colors he likes," David admitted when he saw Sarah in the doorway. "I don't know his favorite foods, his favorite movies, or even what grade he's really in beyond the fact that Mrs. Rodriguez drops him off at school every morning." Sarah pulled up a chair beside them. "Well, why don't you ask him?" she suggested gently. Marcus, who had been feeling much better since starting the antibiotics, looked up from his coloring with surprise. "You want to know what I like, Dad?" The simple question seemed to break something inside David. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to know everything." What followed was the most honest conversation father and son had ever shared. Sarah watched as Marcus tentatively began opening up, sharing that his favorite color was actually green because it reminded him of the park where his mother used to take him, that he loved science class but struggled with reading, and that he had been afraid to tell his father when he felt sick because he didn't want to interrupt his important work. "Your health is more important than any work meeting," David said firmly, taking his son's small hand in his. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you couldn't talk to me." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she witnessed this breakthrough. She began to quietly slip out to give them privacy, but Marcus called after her. "Sarah, will you stay? You make Dad less scared." The innocent observation hit both adults like a lightning bolt. David realized that his son had noticed his father's anxiety and fear, and Sarah understood that somehow her presence had become a source of comfort for this struggling family. Over the next day, an unexpected routine developed. Sarah would visit during her breaks, and the three of them would spend time together. She helped David navigate the medical updates from the doctors, translating complex medical terminology into language he could understand. More importantly, she served as a bridge between father and son, facilitating conversations and helping them discover each other. "You're really good at this," David observed during one of these visits, watching Sarah help Marcus with a puzzle while explaining how the respiratory system worked in kid-friendly terms. "I've always wanted children of my own," Sarah admitted quietly. "But between caring for my mother with Alzheimer's and working night shifts, the timing never seemed right. I'm 34, single, and sometimes I wonder if that ship has sailed." David studied her face, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman behind the angel who had saved his son. "You'd make an incredible mother," he said sincerely. "You have this natural way with kids that can't be taught." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Wells making her final rounds. "Marcus is responding beautifully to treatment," she announced. "His chest x-rays are clear, his oxygen levels are normal, and I think we can discharge him tomorrow morning." Marcus cheered, but then looked worried. "Will I still get to see Sarah?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized she didn't want this connection to end either. "Maybe your dad and I can figure something out," she said carefully, not wanting to overstep boundaries. That evening, after Marcus had fallen asleep, David walked Sarah to her car in the hospital parking garage. "I don't want to impose," he began hesitantly, "but would you consider having dinner with us this weekend? Marcus has been asking about you constantly, and honestly, I think I need your help figuring out how to be the father he deserves." Sarah looked at this man who had been completely transformed by nearly losing his son. Gone was the arrogant businessman from the cafe, replaced by a vulnerable father desperate to do right by his child. "I'd like that," she said softly. "There's something else," David continued, his voice uncertain. "My company, Chen Technologies, has been looking to establish a corporate wellness program for our employees. We want to hire a medical professional to oversee health screenings, wellness education, that sort of thing. The pay would be significantly better than hospital nursing with normal daytime hours. Would you be interested in hearing more about it?" Sarah stared at him in surprise. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," David corrected. "You saved my son's life, and in the process you've shown me what I've been missing. I'd love to have someone with your skills and instincts looking out for my employees' well-being the way you looked out for Marcus." The offer was tempting. Better hours would mean she could spend more time with her mother during her decline, and the improved salary would ease some of the financial pressure she'd been under. But she was wary of mixing the personal connection they'd developed with a professional relationship. "Think about it," David said, reading her hesitation. "There's no pressure. The dinner invitation stands either way." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she was a single nurse going through the motions of her routine existence. Now she found herself caring deeply about a lonely little boy and his workaholic father who was trying desperately to change. Meanwhile, across town, David sat in Marcus's room, watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. The breathing that had been so labored and concerning was now steady and strong. But more than his son's physical recovery, David was amazed by the emotional healing that had begun. "Dad," Marcus whispered in the darkness. "I'm right here. Buddy, I like Sarah. She makes everything feel safer." David smoothed his son's hair, thinking about the remarkable woman who had appeared in their lives like a guardian angel. "I like her too, Marcus." "I like her too." As father and son drifted off to sleep, neither could have predicted that this medical crisis would become the foundation for something beautiful. A family neither of them had dared to hope for, brought together by one woman's quiet observation and caring heart. The dinner invitation turned into something much more significant than any of them had anticipated. Sarah arrived at David's upscale Bellevue home on Saturday evening, nervous about stepping into his world but excited to see Marcus. Outside the hospital setting, the house was impressive but cold, clearly expensive but lacking any warmth or personal touches that would make it feel like a home where a child lived. Sarah noticed immediately that while David had spared no expense on furnishings and technology, there were few family photos and even fewer signs of Marcus's presence in the main living areas. "Welcome to our house," Marcus said proudly, taking Sarah's hand and leading her on a tour. His bedroom was a different story entirely, filled with books, science experiments, and drawings that showed a creative, intelligent child who spent a lot of time alone. "Did you draw all of these?" Sarah asked, examining the detailed sketches covering one wall. "Yeah, I like to draw when Dad's working late," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm really good at it." David appeared in the doorway, having changed from his typical business attire into jeans and a casual shirt that made him look years younger and far more approachable. "I'm embarrassed to say I've never really looked at his artwork," he admitted. "This is incredible, Marcus. You're really talented." The evening that followed was a revelation for all three of them. Sarah watched as David made genuine efforts to engage with his son, asking questions about school, friends, and interests he had never bothered to explore before. Marcus, initially shy about having his father's full attention, gradually opened up and began sharing stories and jokes that had Sarah and David both laughing. "You know," David said as they cleaned up after dinner, "I can't remember the last time I heard Marcus laugh like that." "He's a wonderful kid," Sarah replied. "He just needed someone to really listen to him." As the evening wound down, Marcus fell asleep on the couch between them while they watched a movie he had chosen. David carefully carried his son to bed, and when he returned, he found Sarah looking at family photos on the mantel, the few that existed. "That's Elena, my wife," David said softly, pointing to a beautiful woman with Marcus's dark eyes. "She died in a car accident when Marcus was 5. I threw myself into work afterward, telling myself I was building security for his future, but really I was just running from the pain." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the grief he still carried. "Losing someone you love that way must have been devastating." "It was," David admitted. "But I think I've been using that grief as an excuse to avoid really living, really being present for Marcus. Elena would be furious if she knew how disconnected I'd become from our son." They talked until nearly midnight, sharing stories about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Sarah told him about her mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis, how she had been slowly losing the woman who raised her while trying to maintain her independence and career. David spoke about the pressure of running a company that employed hundreds of people, and how the responsibility had gradually consumed every aspect of his life. "The job offer I mentioned," David said as Sarah prepared to leave. "I was serious about that. But I want you to know it's not just about having you around more, though. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. Our employees really do need someone who cares about their well-being the way you care about your patients." Sarah had been thinking about the offer all week. What would the position actually involve? "We'd want you to develop and oversee a comprehensive wellness program," David explained. "Health screenings, stress management workshops, maybe even on-site medical care for minor issues. You'd have a budget to hire additional staff and create programs that actually make a difference in people's lives." The opportunity was everything Sarah had dreamed of. Professionally, a chance to make a broader impact while still using her medical skills. "I'd want to meet with your HR department and see your current employee health data before making a decision," she said. "Of course. How about Monday? I can arrange meetings with the entire leadership team." Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into both David's professional world and his personal life. The job offer was legitimate and impressive. Chen Technologies was willing to invest significantly in employee wellness, and they wanted her to build the program from the ground up. More importantly, she was becoming an integral part of Marcus's life. She attended his school science fair, helped him with homework, and even convinced David to take a day off to go to the zoo together. The difference in both father and son was remarkable to witness. "You've changed everything," David told her one evening as they watched Marcus play in the backyard. "He's happier, more confident, and he's actually talking to me now instead of just answering in monosyllables." "You've changed too," Sarah observed. "You're not the same man I met in that cafe." David nodded thoughtfully. "Nearly losing Marcus was a wake-up call, but meeting you showed me what I was missing. Not just as a father, but as a person." Their relationship was evolving naturally from friendship into something deeper, though neither wanted to rush or complicate things given Marcus's needs and Sarah's ongoing responsibilities with her mother. But the connection between them was undeniable, built on mutual respect, shared values, and a genuine affection that had grown from the crisis that brought them together. "I've been thinking about your mother," David said during one of their conversations. "You mentioned that caring for someone with Alzheimer's is incredibly demanding. What if we could arrange for additional support for her? Professional care that would give you some breathing room while ensuring she gets the best possible treatment. Sarah looked at him with surprise. That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't accept something like that. It's not charity, David said firmly. It's an investment in someone I care about. You've given Marcus and me a second chance at being a real family. Let me help you take care of the person who matters most to you. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah found herself imagining a future she had never dared to dream of. One where she could make a difference professionally, care for her mother properly, and be part of the loving family that Marcus deserved. The quiet nurse who had simply noticed a sick child was discovering that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could reshape entire lives, but she had no idea that David's gratitude was about to take a form that would change, not just their personal relationship, but her entire understanding of who he really was and what her simple act of observation had truly saved. Sarah had been working at Chen Technologies for 2 months when she stumbled upon the truth about just who David Chen really was. She had accepted the position as Director of Employee Wellness, and the work was everything David had promised: meaningful, well-funded, and making a real difference in people's lives. The revelation came during a routine staff meeting when David's assistant mentioned an upcoming interview with Forbes magazine about his inclusion on their list of most influential CEOs under 45. Sarah sat in the conference room, suddenly understanding why David's last name had seemed vaguely familiar when she first heard it. After the meeting, she discreetly Googled David Chen CEO on her phone. The results made her stomach drop. Chen Technologies wasn't just any successful company. It was a multinational corporation worth over $2 billion. David wasn't simply a busy executive. He was one of the youngest billionaires in the tech industry, frequently featured in business magazines and known for his innovative approach to artificial intelligence and data security. The man she had been casually dating, the father who struggled to connect with his son, was worth more money than she could even conceptualize. Suddenly, his expensive suits, the lavish house, and his ability to offer her mother the best medical care made sense in a way that left her feeling dizzy. That evening, Sarah sat in her modest apartment staring at article after article about David's business empire. Photos showed him at exclusive charity galas, accepting prestigious awards and being interviewed by major news outlets. The contrast between the powerful CEO in these images and the vulnerable father she had gotten to know felt surreal. Her phone rang, interrupting her research spiral. It was David calling to confirm their plans for the weekend. "Sarah, you sound distant. Is everything okay?" "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Why didn't you tell me who you really are?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I just discovered I'm dating one of the wealthiest men in Seattle, possibly the country." "Forbes has you listed as worth over $2 billion, David. $2 billion. David sighed deeply. "Can we talk about this in person?" "I can come over or you could come here." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Marcus doesn't need to be part of this conversation. Just tell me why you didn't think I should know." "Because," David said quietly, "for the first time in years, someone was seeing me as just a person, not as a business opportunity or a target. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Everyone wants something from me. Investors, employees, charity organizations, even people I try to date. But you looked at me like I was just a worried father who needed help." Sarah felt her anger wavering but pushed forward. "I had a right to know." "This changes everything, does it?" David asked. "Does knowing how much money I have change the fact that I almost lost my son because I was too selfish and self-absorbed to pay attention? Does it change the fact that you saved his life or that you've taught both of us what it means to be a real family?" Sarah found herself crying, though she wasn't sure if it was from anger, confusion, or overwhelming emotion. "It changes the fact that I thought we were equals. I thought this was real." "It is real," David insisted. "Sarah, the money doesn't define who I am. You've seen who I really am. The father who was failing his son. The man who was so lost in his own success that he nearly destroyed what mattered most. That's the real me, not the guy in the magazine articles." Over the next few days, Sarah struggled with this new reality. She confided in her mother during one of her increasingly rare lucid moments. "Money doesn't make someone a good or bad person, sweetheart," her mother said with unusual clarity. "What matters is how they treat you, and whether they make you happy. Does this man make you happy?" The answer was yes, but Sarah wasn't sure if that was enough. She had fallen in love with David Chen, the father, not David Chen, the billionaire CEO. The disparity in their backgrounds felt overwhelming. Her internal conflict was interrupted by an emergency call from David. "Sarah, I need your help. There's been an incident at the company and I think someone might be trying to hurt Marcus." Within an hour, Sarah found herself at the Chen Technologies headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower in downtown Seattle that she had never visited before. David met her in the lobby, his face pale and drawn with worry. "What happened?" she asked immediately. "We received a credible threat against me and my family," David explained as they rode the elevator to his office. "The FBI thinks it might be connected to a business deal that went bad. They want to put Marcus and me in protective custody until they can identify the source." Sarah's nurse training kicked in, pushing aside her personal confusion. "Where is Marcus now?" "Safe house with federal agents." "But Sarah, he's terrified. He won't talk to anyone and he keeps asking for you. The agents think having someone familiar with him would help." Without hesitation, Sarah agreed to go with them. As they drove through Seattle in an unmarked FBI vehicle, David reached for her hand. "I know this is overwhelming," he said quietly. "Learning about my wealth and now this threat. I never wanted any of this to touch your life." Sarah looked at him, seeing past the billionaire headline to the man she had fallen in love with. "Your money doesn't scare me, David. The thought of losing you and Marcus does." The safe house was a nondescript suburban home where Marcus was being protected by 2 federal agents. When Sarah walked through the door, the 8-year-old boy ran straight into her arms. "I knew you'd come," he whispered against her shoulder. "Dad said the bad people might try to hurt us, but I knew you wouldn't let them." As Sarah held Marcus, she realized that the size of David's bank account was irrelevant. What mattered was this child who trusted her completely, and the man who had shown her what love could look like when built on genuine care and respect. "We're going to get through this together," she promised Marcus, but she was really speaking to all 3 of them. That night, as they waited for the FBI to neutralize the threat, Sarah finally understood what David had been trying to tell her. His wealth was just a circumstance of his success, but his character had been revealed during their son's medical crisis and in the quiet moments when he thought no one important was watching. She had fallen in love with the real David Chen, and no amount of money could change that. The FBI investigation concluded 3 days later with the arrest of a disgruntled former business partner who had made threats against David and his family. The immediate danger had passed, but the experience had crystallized something important for all 3 of them. They were no longer just individuals whose lives had intersected by chance. They had become a family worth protecting. Standing in the safe house kitchen on their final morning there, Sarah watched David make pancakes for Marcus while helping him with his math homework. The scene was so perfectly domestic that it was hard to believe this was the same man whose photo had been on the cover of Business Weekly just months earlier. "Sarah," Marcus said suddenly, looking up from his multiplication problems, "when we go home, are you coming with us?" The innocent question hung in the air, loaded with hope and possibility. Sarah looked at David, who had stopped flipping pancakes to watch her response. "I'd like that very much," she said softly, "if your dad thinks it's a good idea." David set down the spatula and walked over to where she was sitting. "Sarah Martinez," he said, taking her hands in his. "6 months ago you saved my son's life. But you did something even more important than that. You saved mine too." Over the following weeks, as they settled back into their normal routine, the truth of David's words became increasingly clear. Sarah moved into the Bellevue house not just as David's girlfriend, but as a true partner in raising Marcus and building something none of them had expected to find. The changes were evident everywhere. The cold, sterile house became warm and welcoming, filled with Marcus's artwork, family photos, and the sounds of laughter and conversation. David restructured his work schedule to be home for dinner every night and to never miss another important moment in his son's life. Sarah's employee wellness program at Chen Technologies became a model that other companies sought to replicate. But more importantly, she had found her calling in creating a work environment where people's health and well-being were valued as much as productivity and profits. One evening, as they sat together watching Marcus perform in his school's science fair presentation, David leaned over to whisper in Sarah's ear, "Do you remember that morning in the cafe when you first spoke to us?" "Of course," Sarah replied. You were so annoyed that I interrupted your phone call. I was about to close the biggest deal of my career that day, David said. A merger worth $300 million. If Marcus had gotten sicker and I'd had to rush him to the hospital in the middle of those negotiations, I would have missed the opportunity entirely. Sarah looked at him with surprise. You never told me that. Because I realized something important, David continued. That deal eventually fell through anyway. But if I had lost Marcus because I was too focused on business to notice he was sick, I would have lost everything that actually mattered. You didn't just save his life. You saved me from a future where I had all the success in the world but no one to share it with. As they watched their son, and Sarah had begun thinking of Marcus, as their son explained his volcano, experiment to impress parents and teachers, Sarah reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed. The quiet nurse who had simply noticed that a child needed help had become the cornerstone of a family she never could have imagined. 3 months later, David proposed during a family camping trip, with Marcus's enthusiastic help and approval. The ring was beautiful but understated. David had learned that Sarah valued meaningful gestures over expensive displays. You saved a CEO, he told her, as he knelt beside their campfire with Marcus grinning beside him. But more importantly, you saved a father and son who were losing each other. Sarah looked at the two people who had become her entire world and realized that she had saved them. But they had rescued her too. The woman who had spent years caring for everyone else had finally found people who wanted to care for her in return. Their wedding 6 months later was small and intimate, held in the backyard of their home with Marcus serving as the ring bearer and Sarah's mother in one of her clearer moments, walking her down the makeshift aisle. As Sarah looked out at the gathered friends and family, she spotted several of her former patients from the hospital, David's employees whose lives had been improved by her wellness programs, and even Dr. Wells and several nurses from Marcus's hospital stay. All of these people had been touched by the simple act of one person noticing that something was wrong and choosing to speak up. In her wedding vows, Sarah promised to love both David and Marcus, to continue being the kind of person who notices when others need help, and to never forget that the most important things in life often reveal themselves in the quietest moments. David's vows were simpler but no less profound. Sarah, you taught me that success isn't measured in dollars or deals, but in the love we give and the lives we touch. You gave me back my son, and you gave us both a future worth living. Now 2 years later, as Sarah tucked Marcus into bed in their newly expanded home, they had added a wing for Sarah's mother, who lived with them and received the best care available. She marveled at the journey that had brought them all together. Mom, Marcus said, using the name that had evolved naturally over time, do you think there are other kids out there whose parents are too busy to notice when they're sick? Sarah smoothed his hair, thinking about the question seriously. Probably, she said. But there are also people like us who pay attention and care enough to help. Maybe that could be our family mission, Marcus suggested sleepily. Helping people notice the important stuff. Sarah kissed his forehead and turned off the light, knowing that Marcus had inherited not just his father's intelligence, but also a heart that would make a difference in the world. Walking downstairs, she found David in his study, but instead of working late into the night as he once had, he was organizing family photos and planning their upcoming vacation. Any regrets? He asked as she settled beside him on the couch. Sarah looked around their home, filled with love and laughter and the everyday chaos of a family who had found each other against all odds. Only one, she said with a smile. David looked concerned. What's that? I wish I had noticed you two sooner, she said, taking his hand. Think of all the pancake breakfasts and bedtime stories we missed out on. David laughed, pulling her closer. Well, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. As they sat together in comfortable silence, both of them knew that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest acts of human kindness, like a nurse who noticed a sick child and chose to care enough to intervene. Sarah had saved a CEO, but more importantly, she had saved a family and in doing so had found her own happily ever after.